I need police at 12 Maple Drive. A girl just screamed inside the house. I'm the delivery driver.
Tobias Reyes had delivered over 4,000 packages in his 11 months driving for the regional courier company, and he would remember exactly one of them for the rest of his life, not because of what was inside the box, which turned out to be nothing more than a set of kitchen towels ordered through an online sale, but because of the 11 minutes he spent standing on a stranger's front porch refusing to leave. Certain that something on the other side of that door was wrong in a way his dispatcher, his supervisor, and eventually 2 responding police officers all initially told him he was almost certainly imagining. He was not imagining it. By the time that Thursday afternoon ended, a house on Larkspur Lane would be surrounded by patrol cars. A woman and a 6-year-old girl would be receiving emergency medical attention in Tobias Reyes. A 26-year-old delivery, as a driver with no law enforcement training and no legal authority to do anything except set a package down and leave, would be credited in a police report that took months to fully process, with likely saving both of their lives simply because he refused to walk away. From a sound he couldn't quite explain, Tobias had taken the delivery job 14 months after leaving a college program he could no longer afford, one of a handful of gig economy positions he'd cycled through while trying to figure out a version of his adult life that felt sustainable. And he approached the work with a specific quiet conscientiousness that his supervisors noticed but rarely commented on. He double-checked addresses. He photographed packages in careful, useful angles. He was, by every measurable metric the company tracked, an unremarkable, reliable employee. What none of his supervisors knew, because it had never once come up in any conversation relevant to package delivery, was that Tobias had spent ages 7 through 11 in a house not unlike the one on Larkspur Lane, a house where the specific quality of silence behind a closed door had once meant something he'd spent nearly 2 decades trying not to think about, and where a single teacher, noticing a bruise Tobias had tried to hide under a long sleeve in warm weather, had asked exactly one question that changed the entire trajectory of his childhood. Tobias remembered that teacher's name even now. He remembered, more precisely, the sick, hollow feeling of every adult before her who had noticed something and said nothing. Before we continue, if you believe that kindness has no rank and grace wears no uniform, please like this video, subscribe to The Overlooked, and share this with someone who needs to believe in people again today. The house at 2214 Larkspur Lane belonged, according to the delivery manifest, to a woman named Diane Castellano, and Tobias had delivered to that address twice before, over the preceding months without incident. A modest single-story home with a well-kept front yard. Nothing outwardly unusual about it, the kind of house that blended completely into the quiet suburban street around it. What Tobias did not know, approaching the front door with a small box of kitchen towels tucked under one arm on that particular Thursday afternoon, was that Diane Castellano's husband? Frank had been escalating for months, in ways that had gone almost entirely undetected by the people around them, a pattern of control that had started subtly enough for Diane herself to spend a long time convincing herself it wasn't what it clearly was, and had, over the 2 weeks preceding this delivery, tipped into something considerably more dangerous following Diane's quiet, careful attempts to consult a divorce attorney, an attempt Frank had discovered 3 days earlier by checking her phone while she slept. Frank Castellano had not gone to work that Thursday. He had told his employer he was sick, and had spent the morning instead in an escalating confrontation with Diane that had begun as accusation and control, and had, by early afternoon, evolved into something that had left Diane and her 6-year-old daughter, Mia, locked, at Frank's insistence, in the small downstairs bathroom, ostensibly for their own safety, during what he was calling, with the specific chilling calm of a man convinced of his own reasonableness, a conversation that needs to happen without interruptions. Diane had not been physically harmed yet that day, a fact she would later describe to police as the only reason she'd managed to stay outwardly calm enough to keep Mia from panicking. But she understood, with the specific clarity survivors of long escalating patterns often develop, that the day was moving towards something considerably worse than where it currently stood, and that Frank's calm was, If anything, more frightening than his anger would have been, Tobias knocked on the front door at 1:47 in the afternoon. Expecting the ordinary 30-second exchange of a typical delivery, a homeowner answering, a brief acknowledgement, a signature, or a doorstep drop, if no one answered at all. Frank Castellano answered instead, and something about the exchange, which lasted less than a minute and would have seemed entirely unremarkable to almost anyone else standing in Tobias's position. Snagged immediately and completely on every alarm Tobias had spent a childhood learning, without ever wanting to, how to read. Frank's smile did not reach his eyes. His voice thanking Tobias for the delivery carried a specific brittle over-friendliness that Tobias recognized instantly and involuntarily. A performance of normalcy that Tobias's own childhood home had taught him to detect the way some people detect an off note in music, and beneath it, faint but unmistakable in the half-second, the front door stood open before Frank moved to close it. Tobias heard something that made his entire body go cold. A small, muffled, unmistakably frightened voice, a child's voice, saying something Tobias couldn't fully make out except for a single word that carried clearly enough to freeze him in place on the porch. Please, the dark. Chaotic part of what followed happened almost entirely inside Tobias's own head over the next several minutes. A private, escalating crisis of doubt that nobody around him could see. He told himself, standing on the sidewalk after Frank closed the door, that he was overreacting. That plenty of ordinary households contained the ordinary sounds of a child being disciplined or upset about something mundane. That he had no actual evidence of anything beyond a feeling, a specific old, unwelcome feeling from a childhood he rarely let himself fully remember. He got back into his delivery van. He sat in the driver's seat for nearly 4 minutes without starting the engine. Hands on the wheel, replaying the sound, replaying Frank's smile, replaying the specific quality of silence that had followed the word please, a silence Tobias recognized on some level deeper than conscious thought, as the sound of someone being told. Without words to stop, he called his dispatcher first. A decision that cost him nearly 2 minutes of increasingly frustrating conversation with a supervisor who, reasonably enough from a company liability standpoint, told Tobias that delivery drivers were not equipped to make welfare assessments and that if he had genuine concerns, he should call the non-emergency police line rather than refuse to continue his route. Tobias, sitting outside 2214 Larkspur Lane with his van idling, made a decision that would later be described in a police commendation as exactly the kind of judgment call that likely prevented a tragedy. He called 911 instead of the non-emergency line, and when the dispatcher asked him to describe the emergency, he said honestly that he didn't have concrete evidence of a crime in progress. Only a child's frightened voice, a father's forced calm, and an instinct he could not fully explain but was not willing to walk away from. The responding officers who arrived 9 minutes later were, by their own later admission, skeptical of what they'd find. Welfare checks based on a delivery driver's instinct rarely produced anything beyond an awkward conversation and an irritated homeowner. And the 2 officers who knocked on Frank Castellano's door fully expected exactly that outcome. Frank opening the door with the same brittle friendliness Tobias had encountered 40 minutes earlier. Told the officers everything was fine, that his wife and daughter were simply having a quiet afternoon, that he wasn't sure what would have prompted a welfare check call. It was, by every surface indication, a perfectly ordinary domestic scene. And the officers standing in the doorway came within what the subsequent internal review would describe as a genuinely narrow margin of accepting. Frank's explanation in leaving, what changed the outcome was Tobias himself, who had not left the scene, parked instead a discreet distance down the street watching, and who approached the responding officers directly once he saw them preparing to leave, insisting with a specificity that finally cut through their professional skepticism that he had personally heard a child say the word please in a tone that did not match ordinary childhood upset, and that the man who answered the door had a smile that did not match his eyes. A detail Tobias struggled to fully articulate, but delivered with such evident, hard-won conviction that one of the officers, a 12-year veteran named Sergeant Alina Voss, who had seen enough genuine domestic violence calls to recognize the specific texture of Tobias's certainty, decided the situation warranted one additional step, a request within their legal authority, to briefly speak with Diane Castellano directly and privately away from Frank. Frank resisted this request with an intensity that itself became the second piece of evidence the officers needed, an escalating insistence that his wife was resting and shouldn't be disturbed, that read. Two experienced officers now fully alert to the pattern unfolding in front of them, as exactly the kind of controlling behavior that often accompanies active danger rather than an innocent desire for privacy. Sergeant Voss made the call to enter, citing the specific, narrow legal exception for welfare checks involving a credible report of a child in distress, and found in the downstairs bathroom exactly where Tobias's instincts had somehow correctly placed the danger without any way of actually knowing the house's layout. Diane Castellano and her daughter Mia, both frightened, both physically unharmed, but visibly traumatized. Having spent the better part of 2 hours locked in a small room while Frank Castellano worked through an escalating private crisis that both officers, and later a full investigation, would conclude had been building toward violence, that the intervention had very likely prevented, Frank was arrested that afternoon on charges that would eventually include unlawful imprisonment and domestic violence-related offenses, the specific severity of which would be determined over the following months as investigators assembled a fuller picture of the 2 weeks of escalation that had preceded that Thursday. Diane and Mia were connected that same evening with victim advocacy services and a safety plan that included, over the following weeks, permanent separation from Frank and the beginning of what would be a long but ultimately successful process of rebuilding a life outside his control. Tobias Reyes did not learn the full outcome of that afternoon until nearly a week later, when Sergeant Voss, working through the department's community relations office, tracked down his employer to request a formal commendation be entered into his personnel file. A request that included, at Voss's insistence, a detailed account of exactly how close the responding officers had come to leaving the scene before Tobias's persistence changed their assessment. Diane Castellano reached out to him herself 2 weeks after that, through a message relayed by the police department asking whether he would be willing to meet, an invitation Tobias accepted with the specific nervous uncertainty of someone unused to being thanked for anything, let alone something this significant. They met at a coffee shop, Diane still visibly raw from the recent trauma, but steadier than she'd been that Thursday, Mia coloring quietly at the same table with the particular, unbothered resilience young children sometimes carry through experiences their parents fully understand the weight of, and they themselves have not yet processed, Diane said. I don't know how to thank someone for noticing something everyone else missed for months. I missed it myself, in a way. I kept telling myself it wasn't as bad as it felt. Quietly, I understand that better than you'd think, he told her. For the first time in years, about his own childhood, about the teacher who had asked one question, about the 2 decades he'd spent since carrying an unspoken promise that he would never again be someone who noticed and said nothing. Diane was quiet for a long moment, watching her daughter color. She said, Mia asked me last week why the delivery man stayed outside so long that day. I didn't know how to explain it to a 6-year-old. Tobias said, you could tell her that sometimes the person who helps you isn't the person you'd expect. Sometimes it's just whoever happens to be standing there and decides not to walk away. 6 months later, Tobias Reyes was still driving the same delivery route. Still an unremarkable, reliable employee by every metric his company tracked. Except for the small commendation letter he kept, uncharacteristically, pinned to the corkboard above his desk at home, not as a trophy, he told the few people who asked about it, but as a reminder of the version of himself who had almost talked himself out of trusting an instinct that turned out to matter more than anything else he did that entire year. If this story moved you, please like this video, leave a comment, and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe to The Overlooked for more stories of courage, grace, and the small human moments that change everything. And tell us in the comments, has your instinct ever told you something was wrong before you had any real proof? And did you trust it?